Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining me for this webinar on mastering your qualitative methodology. My name is Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions. We're a full service dissertation consulting company. And what that means is that we are here to provide assistance and support to doctoral students like yourselves at all stages of the dissertation process. So from beginning at topic development all the way through to the end of it at the final dissertation defense and everything in between. And so we have a team of research, qualitative and quantitative mentors on staff here to really help out. So you will see in the chat, I am joined in the background by Brittany, who is kind of running things behind the show in case of technical difficulties, but she has put some links into the chat if you want to find out more about us, our homepage, and also make use of any of the terrific free resources available to you on our website. You can get signed up for other webinars. You can check out our upcoming webinar schedule as well as archived webinars. And then we also have a blog with really any topic you could possibly want. We probably have a blog post about it on our website. So definitely check those out. You will, as an attendee today, receive a copy of the webinar within the next 24 to 48 hours, as well as the slide deck. So if you're coming in late, don't worry about that at all. We've got you covered. So again, good information in the chat. And if you do have other questions during the webinar, you can pop those into the chat or you can pop them into the question and answer box. If you have questions that are about the services that we provide and the assistance that we provide, Brittany can field those questions kind of behind the scenes during the webinar. And then if you have questions that are specific to qualitative methods, I will leave time at the end so that we can address those. So again, this is Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology. I'm Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions. Let's get started. So this slide presents both an overview of the webinar today as well as what should go into your methods chapter. So we'll talk about each of these sections of the methods chapter. This is a compilation of what I have seen most frequently over the years working with doctoral students. So it's sort of a compilation of what different schools require, and it's pretty comprehensive. Okay, so if you don't really know where to start or what should be included in this chapter, if you get each of these sections into the methods, then you should be good to go. The one caveat that I will say is that if your school does provide a template, checklist, something that looks different from this in any way, you do need to follow whatever your school provides. You will have enough hoops to jump through as a doctoral student and as a doctoral candidate anyway. There's no point in making extra work for yourself by not following what they tell you to do. So you will start with an introduction. We'll include the research design, role of the researcher, methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and a summary at the end. So we'll touch on each of these sections and talk a little bit more specifically about what needs to go into each of these sections in the webinar today. In your introduction, you want to restate the purpose of your study, and you want to do this verbatim. Okay, so you can literally copy and paste the purpose of the study that you outlined in your introduction chapter into the introduction of your methods chapter and anywhere else that you see this. This is not the place to start changing things and get creative. And it might start to feel, I realize, very, redundant to see the same thing written the same way in a million different places in your dissertation. But changing words changes meaning, right? And that meaning may have implications for your design and for your study. So don't change any of the words. You also want to preview what is upcoming in the chapter, okay? So each of those major sections, what are you going to talk about? So I like to think about this as, you know, you look back and you look forward, right? So you're sort of transitioning from the previous chapter and then looking forward and highlighting for the reader what they can expect. In your research design section, you want to restate the research questions very clearly, again, word for word. So exactly the same. So just like the purpose was verbatim, so are the research questions. Do not change these at all. Don't change the wording. Don't do anything there. So restate the research questions. You're reminding the reader what your study is about, right? And what those research questions are that you're going to address or answer using the design. Then you want to identify whatever that concept is that you're studying. You know, so maybe you're doing a case study and you're defining the case or cases, and maybe it's a phenomenological study, and so you're defining what the phenomenon is. But you want to identify and define that very clearly for the reader. Then you want to talk about your approach. So is it qualitative or quantitative? And in this case, I'm going to move forward assuming it's qualitative because this is a qualitative methodology webinar. And you don't want advice from me about quantitative studies, just take my word for that. So identify if it's qualitative or quantitative, and then you want to identify the design as well. So what is the qualitative research design that you're using? For both the qualitative study and the design specifically, you need to demonstrate that you are familiar with both qualitative and quantitative studies and perhaps mixed methods. And you want to justify why the qualitative approach is the most appropriate. So I like to think about this as, you know, maybe a couple of paragraphs, sort of just high level outlining why a researcher would use a qualitative study, what they're good for. Same thing with quantitative, same thing for mixed methods, and then drive home why the qualitative is the best fit for your study. Okay, this should be aligned to your problem, your purpose, and your research questions. There needs to be alignment across all of those things. And your problem, purpose, and research questions are what drive the research design. It's not the other way around. So you wouldn't approach the study saying, I'm going to conduct a case study and then work backwards from that point. That's not how it works. So you want to make the case that the qualitative study is the most appropriate, and then you do the same thing for the design. And so to do this, I would present a couple of qualitative designs, talk again about how researchers use them and in what types of studies they're useful, and then drive home why the design you selected is the most appropriate. Okay, because you can't demonstrate that one is the most appropriate if you don't show that you know the circumstances under which others would be effective. You're also telling the reader and your dissertation chair that you know what you're talking about when you identify different possible designs. So why would we use a qualitative design? Oftentimes, our research questions might be along the lines of trying to understand participants' perspectives on something, or their experiences with something, or their lived experiences and how they make meaning from, you know, an experience. So to really get at this, then we would collect data through probably interviews and maybe focus groups, so individual versus groups, maybe some document analysis, maybe observations. Those data collection methods yield textual data, words. So I think of qualitative as words. And if that is the study that you if that's the approach that you need to address those research questions, then it's a good indicator that it should be a qualitative study. The goal, unlike in quantitative studies, although, I'm sure we can certainly debate the extent to which this is true, but the goal is not necessarily to generalize findings in a qualitative study, because you are looking at probably a small group of people who are similar in some way. You're not hypothesis testing. So we don't develop hypotheses in qualitative research, and we don't quantify our research or our results either. There's no need to do that as we would in a quantitative study. But again, the research questions ultimately are going to be what drives the qualitative approach that you're using. So there are any number of qualitative designs. This list is not exhaustive. This is what I see most commonly in students I work with, that they're using one of these approaches. One of these designs. So I will give just a kind of high-level overview of when these might be the most appropriate. But again, keep in mind that there are not only 5 qualitative research designs, there are others. So case studies, phenomenological studies, generic, or I also hear like a descriptive qualitative study, grounded theory, or ethnography. So case studies are really helpful when we're looking at a specific example of something, perhaps over time. It's a really in-depth analysis of that case. Or if it's a multiple case study, an in-depth analysis of the cases. Okay, so I like to think of this as a really deep dive into something, looking at it from 360 degrees. Okay, so it's a really holistic look. Multiple case studies are, if you have more than one case, they have to be bounded by something that is uniting them. Okay, something that is the same, like a common thread. Case studies make use of multiple data collection methods. So you probably wouldn't be conducting interviews and only interviews. You might also pull in some document analysis. You might conduct observations. You might, use these other forms of data collection. That's really one of the, I think, sort of hallmarks of case studies. And this makes intuitive sense, because if you're really drilling down into a case and looking at it from all angles, you want different types of data to inform what you're learning about. The outcome then is generally a really rich description of that case. And you could use something like a thematic analysis to determine the themes or the patterns that emerge from the study of the case or cases. Phenomenology is a bit different. It has philosophical underpinnings. Also, it's deeply rooted in psychology because it has to do with lived experiences and making meaning. So if you're exploring how people make sense of their lived experience of something, then it's probably a phenomenological study. And even within phenomenology, there are different types of designs. So again, high-level overview here, but be aware that there are some different approaches to phenomenology that are out there. Phenomenological studies make use of in-depth interviews. We rarely see other forms of data collection included in phenomenological studies. In-depth means probably hours spent with participants and perhaps multiple interviews as well. And the outcome of this is a really rich description of whatever the essence of the experience is, the phenomenon. Okay, so what you're looking for are what is the common structure to this phenomenon that everyone experiences. So it's distilling the experience down to this, like we call it essence, okay, that there's some core to it. And then how people make sense of this, how they assign meaning to this. Generic qualitative designs are very helpful when your study maybe doesn't fit nicely within kind of the framework of a phenomenological study or an ethnographic study. So again, I sometimes hear these called like descriptive qualitative studies or general qualitative studies. There's research, there's literature that you'll find using the different terminology. Generic is, it doesn't mean less good in this case. I think it has a stigma attached to it, even though there's plenty of literature supporting the use of a specifically generic qualitative design. But it turns some people, including dissertation chairs, off, which is unfortunate. So if you're less concerned with how people make sense of an experience and you're more concerned with the experience itself, so the focus is more outward and not the psychology, not the inward experience, a generic or generalized approach might be more useful. And here you could also use interviews, questionnaires, surveys, either written or oral, documents, observations, right? Whatever data collection techniques you need to address your research question. And I popped this Percy and colleagues citation in here because it is one of the better articles that I have seen in support of a generic qualitative approach. So if you are struggling with, a chair who doesn't think that this is a viable or defensible design, you can say, hey, wait, but people have written about this. It's perfectly fine. So do keep in mind that this is always a possibility, and sometimes it makes the most sense. What is helpful about it is that it's flexible. So unlike some other approaches where you have to adhere to, a sort of prescribed design, you don't have to do that with the generic qualitative design. And it doesn't mean that you can just pick and choose whatever you feel like. Everything has to still be justifiable, defensible in the context of your study, but you have the freedom to select the data collection techniques, for example, that make the most sense for your study, and the data analysis plan that makes the most sense for your study. So there's greater flexibility there, which is why I think it's pretty cool. Grounded theory, I don't see a whole lot. This is really sociological in nature. Social sciences use this. Grounded theory works a little bit differently because you wouldn't be working from a theoretical framework, and you wouldn't necessarily be working from research questions. The idea here is that there's not a whole lot known about a topic. And so through data collection, and this could be field work and extensive memoing, interviewing, maybe some participant observation, you learn more about the topic and you refine your ideas and your research questions based on this, and then you continue to collect data. So it's an iterative process, and it starts kind of in a different place. So it's not always best for novice researchers. It is also both time consuming, and then of course that can lead to being financially consuming as well. It can take time and money. So it's not necessarily resource friendly as well for doctoral students who are just trying to finish the program and get on with their lives. The outcome is that you develop a theory rooted in your data. Okay, so an explanation of whatever's going on, whatever that concept is, process, action, interaction, that you develop the theory from what you're seeing in the data, as opposed to taking your theory and allowing it to guide data collection and analysis. Ethnography, I also, I don't see a whole lot in the students I work with. This is really anthropological in nature, also sociological. It makes use of extended time in the field, participant observations. So again, in terms of resources, it's time consuming and can take money. But it can be really helpful if we're trying to understand the cultural or societal context of a problem, right? Of your research problem. So this is holistic in nature as well. We're looking at networks of people or other institutions, groups of people to understand all of the circumstances surrounding whatever that research problem is. And so the outcome from this is an in-depth account of whatever that problem is from the perspective of the participants, but also the researcher as sort of an insider and an outsider and placed within the larger cultural context. And so that's the process is called ethnography, and the outcome, the written product, is also ethnography. You will have different roles in your research. So you'll have a section in your methods chapter about your role in all of this. Okay, so if you're conducting grounded theory or an ethnographic study, your role is probably a participant observer, okay, where you're both observing people as well as participating in the activities of daily life. But that might not be the case. Maybe you are simply an observer. You are the one who is interviewing participants, okay? Or maybe you're really lucky and you have a research assistant to do that for you. This section is where you outline the specifics of your role. So we impact our research no matter what. We need to be clear and show the reader the ways in which we're sort of engaged with our research, because this helps us identify bias, okay? We all bring something, we're humans, we're working with humans, so there's always this potential for bias. Your research problem, of course, is something that should be established from the literature, but certainly the research that we undertake is probably of personal interest to us as well, right? So we may have blind spots in our research. So this is where we want to talk about that and how we will mitigate any influence that we do have on our research outcomes. So that transparency is sort of what you want to be aiming for in this section. Also, if there are any power differentials between you and your participants, this would be a place to talk about those and how you plan to mitigate any of that. Other ethical issues. So, do you work at your research site, right? Or are you in a position of authority over potential participants? Those would be the kinds of things that you would also discuss in this section. And then again, really the emphasis is on how you plan to handle all of that, to reduce bias, to be transparent, to mitigate any of those potential conflicts. In the methodology section, you will probably have a couple of different subheadings underneath this. So your participants, your instrumentation, your procedures, all the written procedures, right? Recruitment, participation, data collection, and then data analysis plan. So we'll take each of these. For your participants, you want to talk about the overall population from which your sample will be drawn. Overall population is all the possible people who could be in your study, okay? They will not be in your study. That is why you have to sample. Okay, so the overall population, and then what's your target group and what's your sample? How will you sample? So qualitative studies, you are probably not going to be using random sampling. You'll probably be using some kind of purposeful sampling, because there's a good chance that whatever it is you're studying, you need people who fit certain criteria, right? So they're not going to be random. So you want to establish in this section your inclusion criteria. So what are those characteristics that people must meet to participate in your study? Do they need to be between certain age limits? Do they need to have worked at an organization for a certain amount of time? Do they need to have, experience with caring for a sick loved one, or is something like that, right? So whatever those characteristics are, that's what you need to include here. And then you want to talk about how you'll verify that. Is it going to be through like a phone screen? Are you going to have a survey monkey survey so that people can state if they meet these criteria or not? Outline that in this section. The number of participants. Okay, so how many participants do you need to recruit for your study? And the steps that you will take to identify, contact, and recruit participants. So I like to think of this as, it's just a linear sort of, first I'll do this, second I'll do this, third I'll do this, but written in a way that flows a little bit better. And then you'll also talk in there about how the sample relates to data saturation, or the point at which you would, for example, interview more people and you're not learning anything new. In your instrumentation section, you want to include information about all data collection instruments. So if you're conducting a phenomenological study with interviews, then you'll have an interview protocol, and you want to describe that interview protocol. But if you have multiple data collection techniques, I would section this out by instrument. So for each of those, then you want to identify, is this something that you're going to create yourself? And if so, what is that based on? If something is already published, if you're using an instrument that's already published, that's perfectly fine, as long as you have permission to do that, and you would want to state that in this section as well. If you're conducting any kind of document review and analysis, you would want to identify what those sources are, and then how you plan to verify their accuracy. Basically, here you want to demonstrate that the data sources are sufficient to address your research questions. So I think sometimes it's helpful here to first set up a table where you can align your data collection technique and your instrument to each research question, so you can be sure that you're getting the data you need. In the procedures, this is where, again, you want to come back to this, first I'll do this, second I'll do this, and so on and so forth. And so what I think can be really helpful as you're working on this is if you do bullet it out at first and then transform that into a written narrative for the chapter. If you're thinking about it in linear terms like that. So for each of the instruments then that you've talked about in your instrumentation section, you'll want to talk about where you will collect data, who you plan to collect data from, the frequency and duration of those data collection events. So how many times and over how long a period, how you plan to record data, and then importantly, any contingency plans in case of loss to attrition, which we know happens because, again, we're working with people and life happens. And so what are you going to do if you've said that you will recruit 12 to 15 people for your study and you only have 8, right? You need to have some kind of plan to still get between 12 and 15. This is where you would also include any debriefing procedures and any follow-up procedures that you plan to conduct. So anything like member checking, where once you've analyzed the data, you present that information to your participants and have them talk to you a little bit more about, do these findings accurately represent your experience? And if so, how? And if not, how? Or transcript verification, where once you have a transcribed interview, you send that to the participant and they can review the transcript for accuracy. In the data analysis plan section, and you'll do this for each type of data, although certainly different data analysis plans can be applied to, you could apply a thematic analysis to interview observational and document data. Okay, so not mutually exclusive necessarily, but you want to talk about how the data are connected to the research questions. And then any coding procedures that you are planning to use for your data. You'll do some type of coding. If you plan to use software for the analysis, then you would include some mention of that here. Software is very helpful for qualitative data analysis. There's no magic button that you can push and have it analyze your data for you, unfortunately. Actually, no, it's not unfortunate. It's a good thing, because we could never get the nuance from a computer that we can get from humans. But it's really helpful to organize data in software. So if there's a program that you plan to use, you would talk about that here. And then you would also talk about how you plan to handle any discrepant cases. So you can think of discrepant cases as kind of like outliers, or the participants who don't seem to fit any patterns, any overall patterns that you're seeing in the data. So how do you plan to factor that into your data analysis and then present it with the results? Because we don't get to just throw those participants out, right? They still tell us something important. You'll include a section on trustworthiness as well. So there's a lot of literature out there about trustworthiness in qualitative research. So there are these 4 tenets of trustworthiness that you'll see a lot: credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So these all have to do with, are we confident that our findings are accurate? Are they applicable to other contexts, groups of participants, scenarios? Are our findings consistent with further replication if other researchers conduct similar studies? And are our findings based on our participants and not ourselves and our own ideas? Okay, there are different ways to establish trustworthiness. And so you could use, again, like member checking or transcript verification. Triangulation is really helpful here, multiple data sources. This triangulation doesn't mean 3. In this case, 2 data sources would be fine for triangulation, but I know the try in there kind of throws people. An audit trail, where you're sort of journaling all of your steps very clearly throughout the data collection and analysis process. What I like to do in this section is have a subheading each for credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And then what I recommend is for each of those, then talking about what it is and then how you plan to establish it in your own study. Your ethical procedures section is going to be very helpful moving into IRB. So the more information that you can pack into this section now, the less work you will have for yourself with the IRB application. So very much a measure twice, cut once kind of thing. Any agreements that you have about gaining access to your participants, your research site, your data. So that would be your school's institutional review board, but also if there are other IRBs required, maybe you're conducting a study in a school and they have their own IRB, any letters of permission that you have from your research site stating that, yes, you do have permission to conduct your study there, include all of that here. This is really where we're talking about our treatment of human participants or human subjects, that horrible word. And so kind of outlining, it's basically the Belmont report and how we plan to ethically conduct our research so we're not harming anyone, as we're doing this. So ethical considerations related to how we recruit our participants, how we collect their data, what we do with the data later on, our treatment of the data. So anonymity is challenging in qualitative research. You probably won't be collecting anonymous data because you know your participants in some way. So then it's maintaining their confidentiality, keeping their data under lock and key. So whatever your plans are to secure their data after you've collected it, and then your school will probably tell you a period of time that you need to hang on to the data. And after that point, then it needs to be destroyed. So then what are your plans to destroy the data after that time period? In your summary, I see people kind of phone it in here because it seems like a throwaway. And that's not, you don't want to do that here. Okay, this is your elevator speech where if someone only has your summary to read, what do they need to know moving into your results chapter, into the next chapter? So you do want to summarize the main points, but you want to dig a little bit deeper here. Again, you're looking back and telling your reader what you told them in the chapter. And then you also want to transition into your next chapter, which is probably your results chapter. But again, think about, what are those key takeaways? If they could only read the summary, what do they need to know? I also have some sort of overall tips for thinking about approaching writing this chapter. What I have seen over the years is that this is a real stumbling block of a chapter. Your introduction generally goes fairly smoothly. Your literature review might as well. Once you get to chapter 3, it's kind of a different way of thinking about your project and of writing. You're not summarizing and synthesizing and critiquing literature like you have in your lit review. You are planning, designing a study that you haven't conducted yet. And I think that's where students get hung up. Okay, it feels uncomfortable and a little bit weird to be planning this all out. And I see students get hung up on the what ifs. Like what if something happens and I'm not able to recruit 12 to 15 people? What if something happens and I have to conduct my interviews via Zoom instead of in person because, well, we're 2 years into a global pandemic? These things are going to happen. So what you want to do is build contingencies in there, but get over the what ifs. Okay. I think a lot of this stems from this feeling like you're locked into place, right? So like you have your proposal and you defend it, and then like it's done. That's it. That's exactly how things have to go. And that I am here to tell you that is not true. Plans change. They are always going to change. If you can't recruit that many people, guess what? It's a limitation. You get to talk about that later, but it is not a big deal as far as being a stumbling block to getting this chapter written. Okay, so I realize that it looks different from the first 2 chapters that you might have written, but get over the sort of perfectionism that often stands in our way, when we're trying to write as doctoral students, and just, think through just what are the steps, what do I need to do to collect the data, to answer my research questions, to address the problem, to address the purpose. And if things change, it's going to be okay. If you're still stuck though, that's where we come in. Again, we are Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation consulting company, and we are here to provide assistance and support to graduate students for dissertations and other scholarly projects. Okay, our website has some amazing free resources. Again, we've got a blog on there with just about every topic that you can possibly imagine. Our webinar schedule for upcoming webinars, as well as our webinar archives, are available there too. We also provide a complimentary 30-minute consultation, and you can schedule that using the link here. You can call us. You can go to our website and self-schedule for a time that works the best for you. And that consultation is really to hear a little bit more about your project and your own unique dissertation needs and how we can provide support and assistance for that, what that package might look like. So we do have some time for questions if anybody has them. And again, definitely check out the chat because Brittany has put some really good links in there for everyone as well. But if you do have questions about qual methods, certainly let me know. We do have some time. Are there any questions I can answer? I don't see anything coming in. No, it's my pleasure. I'm glad that you found it helpful. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions coming in. Thank you all so much for joining me this afternoon, or perhaps it is evening or morning where you all are. Best of luck with your methodology chapter. You can do this. It's absolutely possible. And certainly reach out to us if you have questions or would like to talk about how we can assist you. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.